Here I am with Steve Schramm. I'm Pastor Mark Lambert, Liberty Hill Baptist Church. And we both believe in a young earth age for the earth. Wow, that was awkwardly repetitive. So recently, there has been a guy, Michael Jones, known as channel's Inspiring Philosophy. He did a video on how the Bible does not teach young earth creationism, supposedly, top 10 reasons. We've seen the video and thought, I love Michael, but I don't think these reasons of his actually hold water. And so we're going to take a look at them and respond to that. And so, again, my name's Pastor Mark Lambert. If you're watching this, you probably already know who I am. Pastor here at Liberty Hill Baptist Church in Moody, Texas. That's basically my claim to fame, is that I convinced a congregation somewhere that I know what I'm talking about, and they hired me as their pastor. So I'm glad to do this, man. I just love studying the Bible and teaching. So there you go. That's me. Introduce yourself, Steve.
Steve Schramm. I host a podcast and YouTube channel also called Bible Nerd Podcast, Bible Nerd TV. And I've been doing online ministry stuff since like April of 2017. So you can find anything from me at steveschramm.com. But yeah, kind of the same boat. I don't even have the official pastor title to go by my name. So, but there are some crazy people who trust me to deliver some sort of knowledge every week. I've been a little lax with that lately because of stuff I've been doing in my business. But every time I get a chance, I like to do some Bible teaching. And I'm with you. I love the Bible, and I just want to see it being properly handled and properly taught. And you're going to run into times when you have good Christian brothers and sisters who you disagree with, and this is just one of those issues that it does seem to be contentious. And I know both Mark and I are kind of in the camp of, we can have these conversations without totally coming unglued and hating our brother and our sister and being contentious about it. And so we're allowed to think we're right. And Michael is, of course, allowed to think he's right, even if we're convinced that he's 100% wrong. And I don't want to give away too much here. We're going to kind of go through this, and I'll kind of be quiet and let Mark take the reins for the most part. But one of the things that I thought of when I saw the title of Michael's video, and then learned that we were going to give a response to it and everything. The title of the video is actually the top 10. I think it's something like the top 10 biblical arguments against young age creationism, or the top 10 reasons that the Bible doesn't teach young age creationism or young earth creationism, something like that. And I thought, as I went through them, I thought, well, if these are truly the top biblical reasons not to be a young earth creationist, I think I'm on pretty solid ground. So hopefully, our job throughout this stream is going to be to convince you of the same, or at least to offer some different ways to think about some of the points he made. So I'm excited to dive into them.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned about the, that disagreeing on this issue isn't something that will, disqualify someone from being a Christian, right? That it's a secondary issue. Your salvation doesn't hinge on it. And I just want to say up front, not that I'm under any illusions that Michael Jones will watch this, but I have nothing but love for Michael. His videos are amazing. Top-notch quality. He really does his research. I've been watching some of his stuff on Genesis, his recent video on the archaeological stuff about Abraham and patriarchs. I mean, just excellent stuff. So it's one of those kind of things where I hate to take shots at someone that I really have such great respect for, but I watched this video and I was just like, oh, come on, Michael, that's That's not, no.
Yeah, yeah,
No.
and let me if I could echo and underscore that point. I'm with you. Michael, I think me and you, and of course there are many others. I think over 100,000 subscribers he has, that would all agree and say, man, like this guy makes some really, really great videos. I have to be honest here, like I have the same um point to or problems to point out with this video that I actually have with a lot of other well-argued Christian thinkers, those who are even professional philosophers and apologists. Two that come to mind for me immediately, I'm just going to call them out, are Dr. William Lane Craig and then also Greg Koukl. These men are probably two of my favorite people in the world to listen to. I spend time with their content probably every single day. But for some reason, I don't know why, but for some reason, when it comes to this issue, I don't see the strength in their points that I see on other issues, and I see just small little logical jumps. And we're going to try to point some of those out tonight, and maybe this will give you something to think about. Where maybe this point's being pressed a little bit too far, or this point doesn't quite make the point that you think it does. And so that's the kind of spirit that we want to approach it with. I love Michael's videos, so if he ever watches this, I hope he knows I'm a huge fan. I just disagree here, and I think there's room for that disagreement.
Yeah, I just looked. He's got 178,000 subscribers. So,
it's awesome
because he makes a fine product. I've actually used some of his videos in church.
Wow,
that's awesome. Hey, here's this guy who explains it better than I probably could. So here, let's just play this video. And so, good stuff. But all right, let's get into this. I think the first clip we have here is just kind of his introduction before we get into the 10, because the way he even sets up the whole thing, I think really shows that where he's going wrong. And then we'll unpack it as we go. So let's play this clip.
If you haven't heard, there are millions of people today who believe the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. And about 4,000 years ago, there was a worldwide flood that destroyed all life on land, except for a few people and two of every animal that survived in an ark. The basis of this theory comes from many who say we ought to take a literal or plain reading of the Bible, the holy book of Christianity. The rationale behind this young Earth view is that they are just taking the plain reading of the text, and that Christians who believe the Earth is old have to misconstrue or reinterpret passages to make the Bible fit with an ancient Earth and the theory of evolution. But what many young Earth creationists don't realize is that there are several passages within the Bible itself that create problems for the young Earth theory. Meaning, if we took the plain reading of the text in many places, it would actually contradict the view that the Earth and the universe are only about 6,000 years old. These are the top 10 biblical passages that create problems for the young Earth theory.
Okay, so there we have his little introduction of setting it up. Any thoughts there before I jump in? I've got some notes, but
I mean, the one thing that I think is important to stress at this point is, well, the point that he wants to make is that taking passages literally would create problems for the text. Now, there are a couple different ways that you could actually approach this. And actually, Mark has been on my podcast twice now where we discussed things along these lines. You're going to see that many of the passages that Michael talks about come out of even Genesis 1 and 2. And there are even reasons to think that you could arrive at something like a young Earth, even if you didn't use passages from Genesis 1 and 2. So those are all trajectories that one could go down. The simple point that I want to make here is that if his point is that taking passages literally creates problems, then what one has to do is define what's meant by the term literal, or what's meant by the plain reading. Something that I like to say is the natural reading of the text. And the reason for this is because a lot of times when critics of the young earth or young age view, use the term, what they end up in practice meaning is something like a wooden hyper literalism almost, such that we might say that Jesus was calling himself a door in the I think it's in the book of Revelation when he talks about I am the door. And that sort of thing is not what a young earth creationist means. When we say we take the passage literally or plainly or naturally, we mean that we're taking it according to a historical, grammatical hermeneutic. That hermeneutic allows for metaphor, it allows for simile, it allows for all kinds of features in the text that could be used to exegete the text. And so what we don't want to do, what I fear that Michael has done here immediately, is set up a straw man of what the young age creationist believes. And I think you'll see that sort of, that prediction sort of borne out as we move through some of his later objections.
Yeah, it seems to me that he's not so much arguing against a young age for the earth so much as he's arguing against a specific type of hyper literalist interpretation, which virtually no one actually takes. So we'll see it unfolding as we get into
for
these.
sure.
So let's not
but you're
belabor
right.
that too much. One thing I do want to mention about this idea that and I have heard this, so I'm not going to fault him too much, where it's like, we take the plain reading, whereas the old earth people, they're twisting the scripture to match. It's like, okay, I've heard that claim made by people, and it's like, no, I know legitimate, sincere old earth believers who have a high view of scripture, and they're just doing their best, and for whatever, but I have actually heard old earth people argue where they interpret scripture to fit their old earth beliefs, where it's like they already believe old earth, and then they twist the scripture where they flat out say it can't mean that because the earth is old, so we have to reinterpret that.
Yeah,
So
this is actually, if I can,
Yeah.
this is an important point to make. So, generally, okay, I'm speaking very generally because there's always more nuance. But generally, you have people who are going to take a young Earth creationist view of these texts. You're going to have an old Earth creationist view of these texts, and then you're going to have some who fall somewhere in the middle and say, "Well, I just don't think the Bible is really." Is really teaching that at all. And it's very common for people who fall into that middle bucket to be misunderstood even by both sides. But also sometimes they don't really understand the true gravity of how much this happens. In other words, Michael kind of derogatorily said that young Earth creationists often accuse folks of twisting the text. But again, Mark, I'll just second that point. I mean, again, legitimate good brothers I have interacted with, they will 100% unashamedly tell me, and I even responded to one of them on my blog and directly took his words, and he was not ashamed of this, where he said, yeah, if we have good reason to think that from science we have a particular view that's pretty well understood, then we're going to have to reinterpret our understanding of scripture on that point. I heard Dr. William Lane Craig himself say this yesterday on an interview that I watched, and so it is important to realize that Michael is right. There are people who are going to get his view wrong and misunderstand that. But I would say there are many more people who are in the old earth camp than there are in the, well, I don't really care what the age of the earth is. The text isn't teaching that camp. And so it would not be correct to say that the people in the old earth camp are not doing this, even though I might not agree with some of the young earth creationist language. They're twisting scripture to make, whatever. Like, if we leave all of the inflammatory stuff out and just look at what they're doing with the text and the reasons why, this really is what they're doing by their own admission. That's an important point to make. I know we don't want to belabor this point, but that is a really important one.
Yeah, I think just what the kind of last thing I'd want to say on this is that, we have to be careful not to paint with too broad a brush, right? Because just as there are old earth creationists, even, theistic evolutionists who are, just trying to do the best they can to understand. They're not, going in there twisting scripture, and some that are. But then there's also young earth creationists who are just going into, whatever side we're pointing at, don't paint with too broad a brush. Take the person who's in front of you for what they're actually saying and believe. So, okay.
Good point.
Let's go ahead and jump on in here and see what these top 10 are. See if our belief in the young age of the earth is in trouble here, okay?
Number 10, Genesis 17:17. Genesis recounts the story of Abraham and Sarah, who were old in age and had no children of their own. God appears to Abraham and says he will have a son in his old age, and then in Genesis 17 it reads, "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" So Abraham thinks it's biologically impossible for someone past the age of 100 to have a child. But this seems to contradict the ages of his ancestors, also known as the early patriarchs, who were supposed to live for hundreds of years and have children in their old ages. According to the Masoretic dates, many of Abraham's ancestors were supposed to be alive when God made this promise to Abraham in his 100th year, and his ancestor Eber supposedly outlived him. So shouldn't Abraham's reply to God have been that many people alive are having children in their old ages? So having a child at the age of 100 is perfectly normal. More importantly is the fact that based on what Genesis 12 says, Abraham's own father Terah would have had to have fathered Abraham at his own age of 130. So shouldn't Abraham's reply to God have been that having a child past the age of 100 is perfectly normal? After all, his own father had him when he was 130. The whole episode in Genesis 17 implies Abraham didn't know of anyone, his own father included, who had a child past the age of 100. And this would imply that when Genesis assigns high ages to the patriarchs, it is probably not their literal ages, but symbolic numbers for theological messaging. And that would mean Genesis doesn't give us a literal chronology back to the creation of Adam, damaging the young earth creationist view that the Bible documents through the ages of the patriarchs that the earth is only 6,000 years old. For a better understanding of the symbolic view of the ages of the patriarchs, see our video on Genesis 5.
Okay, so there we go. Abraham would not have found it laughable. He knew that people could have children that old.
Yeah.
This is one of those where I was actually like, okay, well, let's get into the text because, well, I mean, if your own dad sired you at 130, right? Having a kid at 100 ain't sounding so laughable.
Yeah.
So actually, it almost sounds like he's got a little bit of a point on this one.
Yeah, I have to say, when I first heard this, my very first thought on this was, wow, that's actually a really, really good point. Just being honest. And this is why, there's a verse in Proverbs that says, I'm going to butcher it. I don't know the exact way it's phrased, but the point of the verse is, somebody's argument might sound pretty good until you hear the counter argument. And so it's really important to always dig in and not be too, intimidated by things at first. We have faith in the Bible. We trust in the Bible. This is true when we deal with skeptical attacks too. We need to think circumspectly and think about the whole counsel of God and think about the text deeply to see if we're on the right track. Now, I just want to make I'll make one point and then I'll let you come back on it and then have another point too at some point here. But that is, he tends to, throughout the video, use the word imply in a way that I think oftentimes is a stretch. And one of the things he said here on this last round was that Abraham's laughter would have him believing or have him thinking that it was biologically impossible to have a child at 100 years old. I don't necessarily think that Abraham's laughter implies that strong of a conclusion that it was biologically impossible. I mean, I'm sure, and I haven't watched them specifically, but I'm sure in plenty of other of Michael's videos, he talks about the fact that these were not, exactly scientifically minded, people. Abraham was a businessman, a herdsman, and I mean, while he was, I'm sure, smart, he was not necessarily concerned with what was biologically impossible or not. So I think that's just a really strong bit of language there that Michael used that makes his point sound a little bit more potent than it is. I wrote down, well, if anything, maybe he thought it was unusual. Maybe he thought it would be unusual to have a child at that age. But biologically impossible may be too strong. Did you get that sense
and
too?
I would also add, I did, and I actually did a little bit of research on that. I would also add another thing where he said it implies is that Abraham didn't know of anyone who had a child that old. Well, not necessarily. I mean, he could know of someone. It could be something that he knows happens, but is rather unusual. Because you notice a progression where the ages are getting younger and younger through the genealogies, right? I mean, you got people living 800, 900 years. By the time you get to Abraham, you're talking 150, and then it kind of goes down from there. Well, so you get this progression. So just because he happens to know of someone it happened to doesn't necessarily mean that it is the usual occurrence widespread. Give you an example. Did you know that in 2016, right? So just 4.5 years ago, exactly whenever that would be, Mick Jagger fathered his youngest child at the age of 73. Now, if someone were to tell me, if someone were to tell me at the age of 73, hey, you're going to have a kid, whatever, you're out of your mind, dude. I'm 73. Okay, but I know it happens. In 2020, so just last year, there was a woman in India who gave birth to twins at the age of 74. So we know it happens. But if someone told me at that age I'm going to have a kid, I would laugh, even knowing it can and does happen. So it actually doesn't imply, his laughter does not imply what Michael is saying it does.
Yeah, that's great. I can't help. I don't know if it's a dad joke thing or the fact that of the time that we're recording this, but I can't help but think the Moves Like Jagger song has a little bit more significance now after you telling me that little factoid. So anyway, since this is a Christian show, we'll get back to the point. Yeah, that's huge. I'm glad you said that, because totally I would be like, oh, what are you kidding me? I'm gonna have a kid when I'm 73 years old? Absolutely not. But we do know it happens. And you started to make a point there that is very important. It's the other thing that I wrote down, is that Abraham was many generations following the flood. And if you rewind the video or whatever, you can actually see that little chart in Michael's video. Michael's video demonstrates very clearly in that chart how the ages were declining. And so it was a time unlike any other time in the history of the earth. This is the true history of the earth, and we're taking it literally. There has been no other time quite like that. It was a genetic bottleneck of pretty epic proportions to happen there at the flood. And so there's really even no modern comparison that we could just pull from to compare it to. If that really is what's happening, then we have these generations that Abraham was growing up with, and he was watching these generations decline. For all Abraham knew, he wasn't going to live very much longer at all. If you look at the decline, he might have thought that he was only 10 years away from the grave. And so given that context, surely he would have thought it to be unusual.
Well, and with that, I'll add, I found this interesting because notice he uses the dates and the ages from the Masoretic text.
Yes.
The dating and ages from the Septuagint you wouldn't have those previous generations alive. The only
Right.
ancestors Abraham would have known was his father and his grandfather.
That's right. And there's a
and I mean,
lively debate these days about which one is correct.
And not to throw some sharp elbows at Michael too hard, but in his recent video about the patriarchs, he uses the Septuagint dating to support the evidence of Abraham. So I'm like, okay. In this video, you're using the Masoretic text to make your point on the ages, but in that video, you're using the Septuagint to make your point. Which one is it? Septuagint or Masoretic text?
And he may respond to that challenge with, well, most young earth creationists are going to affirm the Masoretic text, so it's a sort of internal critique. And while that may be a fair point, it's certainly not true that all creationists are on board with the Masoretic dates. And I know one personally who's very adamant about taking the Septuagint dates on that and still believes that the patriarchs lived those great ages. So again, with the broad brush.
And I personally kind of lean towards the Septuagint. I'm not, 100% one side or the other.
Yeah. There's a case.
But here's the thing.
There's a case there.
Here's the thing. Regardless of which one you use, the difference is 1,500 years. So is the Earth 6,000 years old or 7,500 years old? I mean, that's all that would really get us to. Now, here's one thing I want to make. Do you have anything else you want to add? I want to make a final point before we move on. Okay. And this will probably get repetitive because one thing I always ask, and I actually teach my congregation, whenever you come across something that just seems like, oh no, what do I do with that? Ask these two words. So what? If we grant that everything that he said about Abraham and the age and the date and his laughter and the implications and all of that, if we accept all of that, how does that affect the age of the earth? I mean, what does that actually do for the dating of the events of Genesis? Okay, so the ages, the large ages aren't accurate. Okay, so are the people representing, kings or dynasties or clans? All kinds of different things people say. Well, okay, it doesn't matter. You're not getting millions of years. You're getting a few centuries added on.
I do have one more point I want to make, because you're right. You're totally right about that. And part of the reason that what you said is true in this particular case is because that we're aware of right now, there are no clear ancient Near Eastern parallels to anything that to like what we see in the genealogies in Genesis. The closest thing that we have to that are like Sumerian king lists. And a lot of times people want to argue about these exaggerated non-literal ages, and to say that there's kind of a parallel between the biblical account and at least the kind of thing that was happening in these king lists. But you have to understand, we have hundreds of years happening in the biblical account. The closest thing to this at all are astronomical 30,000 plus years that these numbers are in these other accounts. They're nothing like what's going on in the Bible. So to say that there's a direct parallel there is a huge stress. And surprisingly, this is one of the things that or a huge stretch. This is one of the things that Dr. William Lane Craig, in getting to his view of Genesis, he actually makes this comparison. This is really the strongest comparison he's got, to say that the Genesis genealogies could be non-literal. And I think if that's as strong of a case as you have, well, I think you need a stronger one personally. So good point. So what? Well, if you know the details, there are some important reasons why it doesn't go through.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get on to the next point that's going to completely undo young earth creationism.
Number 9, Genesis 8. A common view among young earth believers is the idea that the earth was covered in a global flood about 4,000 years ago. When Genesis records that God flooded the earth, it should be understood as literally the entire globe, because it says the waters covered the face of the whole earth. But there is a problem for this view within Genesis 8. Verses 4 and 5 say the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat or Aratu, and the tops of the mountains could be seen at this point. However, later in the chapter, Noah releases a dove and it returns to him because the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. But didn't verse 5 say the tops of the mountains were seen? So verse 9 cannot mean the waters were literally covering the whole earth, implying the entire flood account might be hyperbolic in its description of the flood, and this would mean it was not literally covering the entire globe, but just a regional area. This is also supported by verse 13, where it says the waters dried from the earth. But this obviously cannot literally mean the entire globe, since most of the surface of the earth is still covered by water. So it appears the flood account is describing the flood hyperbolically. It doesn't necessarily teach the entire globe was covered.
Okay, so Noah in that ark. What a crazy guy building a big old boat.
Silly Noah.
Yeah, come on, man. Just take the animals and go for a hike. It was just a local flood.
Right.
You know what? That this is actually more your wheelhouse than mine. So I got a couple little points I might want to make, but I'm gonna let you jump on this.
Okay. Well, I might disappoint you because I'm gonna be super like, this is a really simple point to me. Although I do have a question, sort of like your "so what" question. I have a really good question for people who challenge the flood account like this. First of all, this objection by Michael just simply assumes that all young Earth creationists are hyperliteralists. It's really the same thing again. I'll grant that there could be hyperbole used in the account, but it just doesn't imply that the entire account is written hyperbolically. Those are two entirely different things. Ironically, it's him and his, in the way he was looking at that passage, it is him who would be using the text hyperliterally in order to justify his position on this. It's not. No one thinks that we have to take the text hyper literally here. The words whole earth can mean whole earth, even if a foot of earth was showing. The point is the whole globe was being covered. And so, I mean, really that's the main point that I have with that. But I've always wanted to ask this question. Because I've heard people argue for both from the text. To be fair, I have heard textual arguments given for the regional flood view and for the global flood view, but nobody ever seems to be able to answer this question who takes the regional position. How is it, given the worldview of the people back then, given that they didn't have, necessarily the ability to explore the world like we have today and things of that nature, even though I don't think many times they're given enough credit for how brilliant they were back then. But that's a different conversation. So given that they did have this worldview, that they were limited by travel and other things, how would the account be written if it were meant to teach a global earth and or a global flood, I should say? And and I've heard I've had some old earthers and others grant this point to me before, because it's kind of like, well, it's not really clear how else it would be written to more clearly teach a global flood if it did. So I would say, even if one could argue for a regional flood in the text, for example, you could maybe do that by saying, by pointing to some of the nation states and such that are mentioned in the entirety of the flood account and saying, well, obviously the writer only had knowledge of these areas. Well, okay, maybe, but like, how would the account be written if a global flood was intended? And I think you'd have something that looks pretty much exactly like what we actually do have there.
There we go. Yeah, absolutely. Two things that jumped out at me is, one I'm not going to go into because it would actually launch into big textual, and it's not really what we're getting into now. And I could be completely wrong on what I was thinking. But here's what I want to say, and this is one thing that has just always floored me about the global flood versus regional flood debate. So what? Because when we're talking about the age of the earth, the issue with the flood isn't how big was it. The question is, when did it happen? Not how much land, the waters covered, all of it or a little bit of it. The question is, when did it take place in the biblical timeline of Genesis? And so, again, this is one of those, if you completely grant his point, you haven't undone young age. I mean, young earth creationism is still a viable option on the table.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I had never really thought about that. Just for, I'm sure you know this, but for the sake of the listener, the reason why you're always going to find, and what's really interesting is that when Michael started out this section, he said some young earth creationists. I thought it was really interesting that he said that. He said some young earth creationists take this position. As far as I know, pretty much all of them do. But it's interesting that he said some, because that actually weakens his point a little bit. So that's just an aside. But the reason why so many young earth creationists feel the global flood is important has to do with the nature of the fossil record. Because if you have only a regional flood, then you have to have an explanation for the sort of burial of the fossils and things that we find all over the earth. And you have to be able to explain that stuff without the millions of years of time. And if the flood in the Bible is in fact global, then frankly, we have something that, and this is arguable on a few minute points, but I mean, I think for the most part, flood geologists have been very, very successful in what they have found in models that they've created. And we have a pretty good reason to think that the Bible is reporting accurately about this. And so there is a stake in that for young earth creationist when we start talking about science. But insofar as we're talking only about the text of scripture, then your point is exactly right. It only matters when it happened, not the extent of it in its entirety. And since Michael is going to be the first one to say, well, the first thing we need to focus on is the text of scripture and what it says, then yeah, I think your point is exactly right.
All right. Good point about the fossils. This is why I wanted you to be part of this. You think of those things that I'm not a science guy. That's not the stuff that comes to my mind. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the next one.
Number 8, Genesis 2:24. Young earth creationists are often proud of the fact, and almost go so far as to brag, that they just take the plain reading of scripture and don't have to reinterpret anything. In my debate with Kent Hovind, I asked if he takes all of Genesis 1 and 2 literally, and he replied,
I have a question for Ken on Genesis 2. Do you take the entire chapter of Genesis 2 literally?
Absolutely.
But this is actually impossible, because Genesis 2:24 cannot be understood literally. After Adam is introduced to Eve, it reads, Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Since married couples are not sewn together, this obviously cannot be understood as literal. Some young earth believers try to get around this by saying it's a reference to procreation and the act of making children. But that would mean they interpret the phrase becoming one flesh metaphorically to mean having offspring, since the text does not literally say to make children. Verse 24 is obviously metaphorical language, but that means the text of Genesis 1 and 2 could also be using other metaphors and was not meant to be entirely literal.
Okay, let me go ahead and say this. Let me go ahead and say this so that I can upset some of my young earth brethren, because yeah, I don't go to Dr. Dino for hermeneutics expertise any more than I go to him for tax expertise. I like Kent Hovind. I mean, he did some really good videos once upon a time.
Yeah.
But he's not a great example to stand up as the, emblematic of what young Earth people believe in that sense. I mean,
Yeah.
who
It's
actually thinks that again, the hyper literal wooden,
Yeah.
just like so over? I don't know anyone who means
Yeah.
stuff like that when they say literal.
Well, and it's important. Okay, there's a couple things here, right, going on. So, unfortunately, now, golly, there's so much that could be said. I owe a debt of gratitude for certain to Kent Hovind. I mean, honest to goodness, I probably would not know what apologetics is if it wasn't for Kent Hovind. I mean, he really did have a big impact on me initially. And while I disagree with many things that he has to say, especially the more I've learned, frankly, the more I end up disagreeing with him. I do owe him that great of debt of gratitude. So I'm thankful for that. Now, however, let me say that while part of the issue is that he has such a big platform, and so it is not necessarily it's not necessarily wrong for Michael to use this as an example of young Earth believers, but it may be wrongheaded given that it's certainly not the best representation of scholarly young Earth creationist work. That's what I mean. If we're I think in any other context, Michael would want to have his arguments steel manned instead of straw manned, and so I would like to see the same courtesy extended this way. Now, all that said, I've spent plenty of time with Kent Hovind's content over the years. And when Kent Hovind says that, now again, I didn't see this particular debate, maybe there was more context here, but even when Kent Hovind says, I'm taking the text literally, he does not mean that every single word is literal in the sense that Jesus is a physical door. Okay. And that's the kind of thing that's going on in Genesis 2:24. I have to say, I honestly believe that Michael was being very uncharitable on this point. In fact, I would go so far as to say that he was making a graver mistake on this point than Kent Hovind would have made by affirming it as being literal. Because no young Earth creationist that I am aware of takes that position on that text. There is plenty of reason to think that verse is metaphorical, and plenty of reason to think that other verses in Genesis 2 are metaphorical. You have even some poetry and things going on, but that does not mean that the account is somehow non-literal in its overall usage or its overall meaning. And I get the feeling that the so what question is about to come up again. I still have no idea what this has to do with the age of the earth. But literal interpretation allows for metaphor. It just does.
Yeah. And like this question came up in a series that we were doing at church recently where, the question was, how do you know what to take literal, what to take metaphor? And I mean, the answer to that question is reading comprehension. I mean, whenever you're reading a novel or a magazine or the newspaper or anything, how do you know what to take literal and what to take not literal? Because you know what metaphor and simile and analogy and other figurative and poetic, turn of a phrase, idioms, you know what those things are. Now, with the Bible, we're detached culturally, so, we may have to do a little extra work to pick up on phrases we may not catch right off, but it's the exact same thing. And so, and I don't want to belabor too much on this because I think we've can see that this doesn't actually. I don't even know. Like you said, if this are the top 10, we're in good shape.
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, let me just recommend a little resource for everybody. Now, to be clear, I haven't read this book for myself yet, but I have heard some teaching around it. And the point of the book is obvious enough. There's a book you can grab called Metaphors We Live By. It's a popular level book. I believe it's a popular level book of a more scholarly version that's been done by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. And the overall point of the book is that human beings live by metaphor. We do not realize how often we're using metaphor in our everyday speech. I mean, we use it a lot. Like a lot. Things that you would never think of as being metaphor. This book will, I guarantee you, expose how much you use metaphor. So what's the point? Well, the point is that even through our usage of metaphor, we still mean literal things. There are literal, if we say, we are, I'm not good at coming up with examples off the top of my head, but like if we say we are stuffed, for example, after we eat a big meal, nobody gets the idea that our guts have been ripped out. We've been taken down to the Build-A-Bear store. They've kissed the little heart, placed it in us, and pressed the little pedal and filled us up with plush. Nobody thinks that, but we mean something literal. We mean our belly is full, right? But it's a metaphor of sorts, right? It's a figure of speech. We this is so integral to the way that human beings in general communicate. So it's actually, in one sense, it's harder to approach the biblical text knowing this, and in another sense it's easier to approach the biblical text knowing this. But we can't, in no context do we ever speak with complete literal, blow by blow literal speech. It's almost impossible for a human being to do given our cognitive ability. So take that for what it's worth. Metaphors we live by.
Okay. And I'll just say again, because I think it's just such a useful way of approaching things. So what? You know what, Michael? You're absolutely, completely, totally right. Whenever it says that two become one flesh, it is not being literal. And that affects the biblical timeline. How? Right? It doesn't change one iota of when the timing and dating of when these things happened.
That's
So,
right.
Okay, let's go on to the next one.
Number 7, Genesis 3:22. Genesis 3 recounts the fall of Adam and Eve in the exile from the Garden of Eden. Young Earth creationists believe before this there was no death because God made everything perfect. So Adam and Eve would had to have been created immortal, and the fall resulted in their bodies being made mortal, and consequently, death came as a result. However, Genesis 3 never says their bodies were changed or transformed to be mortal. God curses the ground, but never places any curse on their bodies. In fact, all he does is bar them from the tree of life. Verse 22 reads, "Then the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat, and live forever." The implication numerous scholars have pointed out is Adam and Eve were already mortal, and the only way they obtained immortality in the garden was eating continuously from the tree of life. To make them mortal again, all God had to do was prevent access to this sacred tree. But that means humans were already mortal before the fall and were only granted immortality through a special fruit, not because they were created with immortal bodies. This is also supported by the fact that Adam is called dust, which is an idiom in the Bible to denote that one is mortal. In Genesis, it might just be metaphorical language to denote that he was a mortal human, meaning Adam was mortal before the fall, which implies that death was a possibility before sin entered.
Okay, there we go. No death before the fall. So what do we do with that?
Well, I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on this. I don't know if yeah, why don't you
Um,
start this one out?
Here's the thing, and again, this is one of those where some of my young Earth brethren may not like me too much. I'm not completely sold on the no death before the fall thing. I mean, I'm not about to plant my flag on it, but it doesn't shake my worldview if things died before the fall. I mean, I see the ecosystem. That this is one of the things I've always thought was a pretty good criticism of young Earth. Whenever people say, "Well, now wait a minute, look at the whole ecosystem and the way everything is so intricately designed, where predators and things killing and eating, and I mean, that seems to be the way that God built it. So things are dying and in God's plan, And so I'm just like, well, okay. I don't take a hard position on that, and it's not really theologically going to change anything for me if things were dying before the fall. And if mankind isn't naturally immortal and it was the fruit of the tree of life that made them immortal, again, I come back to, okay, what does this do with the timeline of the age of the earth?
Yeah. Well, okay, cool. So, what just because it may not be clear actually to some people what Michael I think is trying to do here. So the point, the shot across the bow, so to speak, that he's taking at young Earth creationists is that if he can show that death before the fall was possible, then he can extrapolate that to say that humans could have lived for hundreds of thousands of years, or the evolution of humanity could have been going along all along, and the Bible would just have really nothing to say about that. That's kind of the point that he's wanting to make. He doesn't really follow it through all the way, which kind of surprised me in there, but I think that's the point he's trying to make. Now, I too have always thought that the old Earth point that they would make about the functioning ecosystems and things like that, I've always thought that that was a pretty good criticism of the young Earth position, although I still do disagree with it. But my only point on that would be to say, again, Michael, let's say he's able to show that death was possible before the fall. He still has not showed from the Bible that death was actual before the fall. And death being possible is not the same thing as death being actual. And I think that's an important point to make. I mean, it might sound like splitting hairs, but this is the kind of thing you have to do when we're doing textual study and we're trying to get at the meaning of the Bible. At the very, you have to think about the worldview of the people and what they were taught and what they were, being taught by God and what they were writing down. And to think that they meant anything other than, I'm not wording this the way that I really want to, but it's hard for me to think as they wrote these words, and as Genesis 1:28 and 1:29 were penned, which talk about the both the animals and the humans having a vegetarian diet. It's just really hard to believe for me that what was going on in the mind of the writer was that there were thousands of years of death going on prior to the time of creation. It doesn't seem to me like that's what's in the mind of the writer. And if that's what we're trying to get at, what the author meant when he wrote, then we have to be very careful to make these sort of distinctions. And so it's very possible that the writer thought that death before the fall for both humans and animals was possible, and that the fruit of the tree was what was essentially carrying on the immortality, especially of humanity. And if that's the case, fine. The only evidence we have for when the biblical writer thought that death was actual was post-fall. The only time that we see the introduction of the penalty for the actual taking of an animal life as a sort of sin covering for a human sin is in that event. We see the cursing of the ground happening, and we see things like thorns and thistles and having to toil extra hard. So you see, the writer, to make Michael's point, I think the writer of Genesis would have had to have in his mind that for thousands of years prior to Adam and Eve, there was no laborious work going on the earth. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem like the writer of the text is thinking the way that Michael is thinking. I hope I'm making some sense. I'm trying to get around to the point there, but death being possible is not the same as death being actual. And I think that even if the biblical writer thought that death was possible, I don't think that Michael could show biblically that the writer of the Bible thought that death pre-fall was actual. And I think that's what he would have to do in order to prove his point.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because even if I think that, there was animal death, and, I understand the arguments around Romans about, is that all death or just human death? Yeah, there's nothing there that says that, just because it was the tree of life that was keeping them immortal, that still means there was no death, right? That they weren't dying, their natural state.
That's right.
That they were created in, that they lived in, that they existed in from the beginning before the fall, was access to the tree of life. So there wasn't death. They didn't know it. Right. They didn't experience it.
That's right.
And so what's interesting, and you're right, back to your initial point about how he was probably getting at, if death was possible, then, okay, now insert evolution. Okay, but in order to insert evolution, you still have to work with the biblical timeline and when and how exactly did all that happen, because whether or not Adam and Eve were able to kick the bucket pre-fall does nothing with regard to the timeline.
Exactly right. That's right.
So.
That's right. So we're still,
okay.
We're 0 for what? 3 at this point? Something like that.
That was number 4.
Wow. All right. Here we go.
Yeah, there we go. All right, let's move on to the next one.
Number 6, Genesis 2:4. Young Earth creationists often argue that Genesis 2 is a recap of what takes place on day 6 within Genesis 1, when God made humans. But Genesis 2:4 poses a problem for suggesting this chapter is a recap. The verse begins with, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created." This is what scholars call a Toledoth, and it is used throughout Genesis, almost like chapter markers for the ancient audience. However, when this phrase is used, it always introduces what comes after the person or the generations that follow him. It is never used to denote a recap of something that happened prior to this. Biblical scholar John Walton notes that the phrase in Genesis 2 is probably teaching the same idea, and that what takes place in Genesis 2 is meant to be a sequel, not a recap of what happens in Genesis 1. After God establishes the cosmos, he then hones in on one region on the earth to create a garden environment. But this would mean what is commonly viewed as the creation of the first man in Genesis 2 is not actually the creation of the first man. Since in the prequel to Genesis 2, God elects all humans to be his image, and this would take place before Genesis 2 and before Adam is believed to have been created from dust. Scholars like Michael Heiser note Genesis 1 speaks of encompassing all of humanity, not just one man or one couple, implying when God made man in his image, it was meant to include all humans, wherever they were existing at that time. Then Genesis 2 picks up after this with the creation or election of 2 specific individuals to act as priests in the Garden of Eden. So because of the Toledoth in Genesis 2, the implication is Adam came after, when all humanity was made in the image of God, and therefore was not the first human.
Okay, we've been getting Genesis 1 and 2 wrong all this time.
Yes. What a
I mean,
shame.
well, I know, right?
You're gonna have to hang it all up now.
There we go.
Oh,
Yeah. You know, and what's funny is I remember I am I, I I'm a self-proclaimed fundamentalist. Circa, 1910, not,
right.
crazy nut job, judgmental, the dad from Footloose kind of fundamentalist.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I remember, I mean, you want to talk about some fundamentalist cred. I got my degree from Liberty University,
Oh man.
where I had to take a creation, origins course, and I always find it interesting whenever older uh, believers present the Toledoth thing like we know like we don't know what that is. Like it's something that that creationists are just like, oh no, there's chapter markers and okay, so what do we do?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's in
Yeah.
there, man. It's not like we haven't thought of these things.
Yeah.
But one thing, and I'll let one thing that really just jumped out at me. He mentions Walton and that Genesis 2 is a sequel rather than a recap. But Walton doesn't think that Genesis 1, this is really weird for Walton to say it's a sequel because Walton doesn't take Genesis 1 to be events at all. It's a
Right.
description of functionality being assigned.
That's right.
It's a non-event. So how can you have a sequel to a non-event?
That's interesting. I'm glad you caught that. I didn't think about that.
So
Yeah.
anyway, I'll let you kind of jump in with whatever you got.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so what, right? I mean, what you have here, I mean, there are numerous scholars who know how to interpret these passages who would just simply disagree that what Walton and then Jones have claimed about this, allegedly Walton has claimed this, they would just simply disagree with that. I mean, one of the most well-known Jewish interpreters of the text that is often used by Christians is Cassuto, and Cassuto believes it's a zooming in on the events of day 6. So, pick your scholar here. If we wanted to get more technical about it, frankly, I would have to look in, to the text myself a little bit deeper to see if it was, if there was, how much merit there was to this. But for one thing, you do notice that the Toledot in the beginning is the Toledot of the heavens of the earth. It's not the Toledot of a person who is writing about events that have came after him. So there is a fundamental difference between the first Toledot and the rest of them. So I don't know that you can say, in other words, I think it might be another case of just reaching too far to say that it has to mean that it's a strict sequel, that whatever it's talking about would have had to happen after the events of the actual creation day 6. It really seems like somewhat of a stretch to me to have to think that, especially, I mean, when you get into the, well, I mean, I don't know how else to make the point. I mean, I just don't think he's right about it. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm not being clear here, but when you have that, what does it even mean to have the Toledot of the heavens and the earth? Like these are the generations of the heaven and the earth. The heaven and the earth aren't writing what comes after them. So I don't know how you can make that point. It's like the backwards or the reverse of when old Earth creationists want to say that, well, day 7 doesn't have an evening and a morning, so the rest of the days obviously didn't have one either, even though the text says they did. That really doesn't seem to make any sense. What Jones is having to do here is posit a second event. You're actually, and what many try to do now. I don't know that Michael Jones would actually go along with this. But in the past, what many have tried to do is say that these are two contradictory creation accounts. That's what like Meredith Klein and other proponents of the framework interpretation, I believe our friend Tyler Vela, I believe he takes this view as well, that these are actually contradictory creation accounts. I don't think that you can get that. I don't think that that view works when you actually look at the details that are there. But I guess, I don't know, suppose that Michael is right. Suppose he's right and it is a sequel. I'm not really sure how that harms the Genesis account. I mean, like, I guess the worst I would have to do is admit that the humans that are being referred to in Genesis 1 are not Adam and Eve. I'm thinking out loud here, but I guess that's the worst I would have to live with, is that it starts talking about Adam and Eve in Genesis 2. And it's still talking about the events that are going on in the garden, which is what I think it's talking about with day 6. So, okay, I'll grant Michael that point. Let's say that that really is what it means. I'm doubtful that that's what it means, but let's say that really is what it means. Okay, so what?
And one thing I would add, whenever these, Toledoths appear, it's basically, here are the generations of, that's how it's translated. The implication, though, is that here are the tales of, here are the events flowing from, are having to do with, kind of thing. And so if Genesis 1, is creation, and it's just okay, he made it. Now, here are the events going forward involving the heaven and the earth, which actually, because it's like, it doesn't mean, okay, now here's the creation. It just means here's the events that unfold. You might like this. If Heiser is on the right track, then the events that are unfolding very much do involve the heavens and the earth. It is not referring to the physical creation of the heavens, but also the persons in the heavens, and then the events that unfold going forward. And so the generations of the heaven and the earth don't refer to creation of the heavens and the earth, but rather the unfolding events after. I don't know. I'm basically wildly speculating now, so you go ahead and talk before I embarrass myself.
I mean, as you were saying that, I got to thinking about the Bible Project. I don't know how much time you've spent with their content, but I think they do a fair job of kind of explaining some of the stuff. And again, you're maybe those who are watching or listening may be missing some serious context here, talking about Michael Heiser and the Bible Project and stuff. But for those of us who are, I'm not going to recap all that because we'd be here for a very long time. But for those who are kind of up on what we're talking about there, they really talk about, especially in the Bible Project, how you had this intermingling, like the whole Garden of Eden scene was essentially the place where heaven met earth. That is the point. The point is that this was the abode of God on earth. This was the abode of the divine counsel on the earth. And so, while I've never thought about it this way before, again, I'd have to look more specifically at the text, but I think I would be fine with saying that Genesis 1 describes this in the most general of terms. And then the first time that Adam and Eve specifically are called out or whatever are in Genesis 2. I mean, if that's if that's as bad as it gets, I would say fine. I still, again, just to be clear for everybody, the point or the intended implication is that God could have created, just like the evolutionary story would purport, humans that have gone that have lived long before Adam and Eve. And so in the beginning of creation, all humans were endowed with the image of God, and evolutionists say we needed a population of like 10,000 of the last common ancestor in order to get the current, Homo sapiens. And so there you go. Adam and Eve were basically called out from that group, and so on and so forth. But again, while even if, and I don't think it does again, but even if what Michael is saying would imply the possibility of that happen, the question for the faithful interpreter of the Bible is that the idea that the writer had in mind? And I just don't see that anywhere. I don't think it implies that, even if it allows for the possibility of it. That's stretching it too far, in my humble opinion. I think that's all I have to say about that.
And one thing I'll end with this is, if Jones's take on Genesis 1, or something along the lines of, Walton, with it being a functionality or a temple, kind of inauguration, or Tyler's polemic, like anything, it's like it all removes it as an event, and it's a description. It's a theological teaching. And then, so again, I'm back to, how then can Genesis 2 be a sequel of a non-event, which means that the timeline of biblical history actually would start at Genesis 2:4 with Adam and Eve.
Right. That's right.
So we're back to young Earth being on the table, a viable option. He hasn't removed it at all.
Right. It's but if his argument is true, then the intent of his argument fails. Is I think what you're saying. Yeah. We're back to square one again.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Next.
Number 5, Jeremiah 4:23-26. Young Earth creationists often assert that Genesis 1 cannot be read to mean anything other than a literal 6-day creation of the cosmos. When theistic evolutionists interpret it to mean something else, they are reading that into the text. But it seems the prophet Jeremiah used very similar language from Genesis 1 to metaphorically describe the fallen northern kingdom of Israel. In Jeremiah 4, the prophet is warning Judah that they will be desolated like the northern kingdom if they do not repent, and in doing so, he described what happened in northern Israel by heavily borrowing from Genesis 1. He says northern Israel is now formless and void. There is no light, no man, no birds of the air, and no vegetation. Even the very conservative scholar John MacArthur acknowledges the language was taken from Genesis 1 and is used in reverse to speak of what happened in northern Israel. But this language does not mean the fabric of space-time opened up and sucked out the land of the northern kingdom. The sun was still literally shining on the region. There were still humans, and there is no reason to believe birds refused to fly over the area or that no plants grew. Jeremiah is simply using this language to metaphorically say the northern kingdom no longer functions properly. But if the same language is used in reverse in Genesis 1, that implies all it is saying is God took a disordered cosmos and made it function properly for human civilizations to begin. Thus, within the scriptures itself, the implication is the language of Genesis 1 does not mean literal material creation, and therefore does not necessarily refer to a literal 6-day creation.
Okay, here we go. Jeremiah just completely undid the entire Young Earth project. Let's pack it in. We're done.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well,
I'm gonna let you give your reflections, because mine's just getting repetitive at this point. So you go ahead and.
I think if it wasn't so late, I would be able to think of what it is. I think that he's got a logical fallacy going on here somewhere, where he's jumping back and making a conclusion about Genesis 1 that would be unwarranted based on this passage. I'm sure there's some sort of logical or hermeneutical fallacy going on this, but I can't think of it, so I don't want to embarrass myself by by trying to put one out there. But I mean, he's right. It's the language of decreation. It uses these terms very descriptively, very literarily, metaphorically. Imagery is being used, but his conclusion is unwarranted. His conclusion is essentially, well, it's talking about the event metaphorically here, therefore it could be metaphorical. The original event it's referring back to could have been metaphorical. That's essentially his point. But in fact, the exact opposite is usually true. Metaphors and analogies, in order for them to be meaningful, are usually based on something that it is grounded in reality. I mean, if I say, even the stuffed metaphor that I used before, in order for me to be figuratively stuffed, I have to be referring back to a literal meaning of being stuffed. I can't use the figure to refer back to another figure. That doesn't seem to make very logical sense. And so what Jeremiah is doing is using the language of creation and masterfully, in my opinion, inverting it and essentially saying that this event is like decreation. It's essentially like the undoing of the land. It's so catastrophic that it's essentially like the undoing of the very fabric of creation. And so the original depth and meaning and splendor of the event only makes the metaphorical decreation point that Jeremiah is making so much stronger. And I would say, I'm very confident. I'm very confident, given the nature of the writing in Jeremiah versus the nature of the writing in Genesis, that I'm on the right track there. But let's give it the worst case scenario. Let's say I'm not on the right track, and it is just talking about I lost. I hate when that happens. I'm getting old. I lost the point I was going for on that. But again, the point I'm trying to make is that if it's, worst case scenario, if it is all metaphorical language, then we're still back to, okay, well, what does that mean for the timeline of things?
Exactly.
Even if I'm wrong about that, what does it mean? Like, I'm almost positive I'm not wrong, but even if I am, how does this prove old earth creation, or how does this prove that the Bible is not teaching young earth creation? And I'll just drive it further. I mean, what point is Jeremiah trying to make if he's not hearkening back to the literal creation that took place? It's hard to know what he would be talking about.
Right. I think that makes perfect sense. And, and this is one of those things that, you and I have talked about, and whenever I was on your podcast, and, I presented my kind of view of, hey, here's why I'm a young earth creationist. You can take Genesis 1 out of the Bible. I'm still a young earth creationist, because all of these ways that they keep saying, oh, well, it's not literal. You just removed Genesis 1 from any consideration at all with the timeline and dating of creation. Yep. So you haven't done anything to undermine young earth creationism, because you're back to the timeline of biblical history starting at Genesis 2:4.
Yeah.
So
I think you've exactly nailed it.
Okay. Well, let's get on to the next one.
Number 4, Genesis 1:14-19. The most popular objection used against young earth creationism is the fact that nights and days exist before the sun, which is created on day 4. Days and nights cannot exist without the earth rotating and moving around the sun. Young earth believers often reply by suggesting maybe there was another light source, or they will argue that God made the light on day 1 and then gathered it together into the sun on day 4. But this seems unlikely, since Genesis 1 talks about the sun and the moon being created together as lights, and the composition of the moon is not the same as the sun. You cannot gather light together to make the moon. It only reflects light from the sun. Also, you just cannot separate the sun into pieces and have the same resulting chemistry necessary to provide sunlight for plants, supposedly created on day 3. This whole response from young Earth creationists is simply contrived and ad hoc. A more likely explanation is the sun and moon are just elected to serve as signs for seasons and for days and years, instead of being materially created. And this is what Genesis 1 is actually saying.
Okay, so how on earth do we get this whole thing with light before there being the source of the light? Let me just out of the gate, I don't know, maybe I'll start a fight. Maybe this can get interesting. I'm not a concordist, so I don't care.
Can you
I'm happy
define
now.
that for the audience?
So concordism is basically the view that what you read in Scripture as it's describing has to have it matching with the world, have a scientific explanation that it's showing something specific. Like so where it's saying, God said, "Let there be light." Over here, He's creating light, but then over here, He's making the sun and moon, and hey, that's the sun is the literal source of the light, and so. I'm an accommodationist. I think that God, whenever He was talking, He was using the language and the descriptors of the times that the people would understand the point He was trying to get across. The example I always use is the Isaiah, oh goodness, it's either 22:44 or 44:22, where God sits above the circle of the earth, and I've heard people say, oh, well, that circle, see right there, it's saying that the earth is round. And I'm like, no. Or I've either heard people say that word for circle actually means like a ball, so it's like a sphere, it's like a globe. And I've heard people say, oh, well, it's a circle like a disc. So Isaiah believed the earth was flat. And I'm like, I don't think it's either one. I think Isaiah was just saying that God is sovereign over the earth.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm good with that. I don't need to have a specific explanation of the word circle describing the literal shape of the earth. I'm good with whatever. Maybe Isaiah believed that the earth was a flat disk. I don't care what Isaiah believed, because the point he's making is not about the shape of the earth. It's about God being sovereign over it. So that's and so so in Genesis 1, if you're going to nitpick about the scientific issues, which is really funny that he's bringing up the science. Well, this can't be because the science. It's like, well, wait a minute, you don't even believe that Genesis is teaching scientific stuff, so why is he bringing that up? Except he thinks that we do. So
yes.
yeah I'll let you approach it, because I'm not sure where you land on that. So
it depends on what day of the week it is and whether or not I've had my coffee yet. Honestly, I do. I go back and forth almost on some of these issues, especially concordism versus non-concordism, and where I don't think I think I'm comfortable going on record to say that I am a non-concordist, because I think concordism almost has to assume that you have people that the whole scientific foreknowledge thing that was common in the creationist movement of decades gone by. I think you almost have to assume some of that, and I'm not comfortable, given what I have learned about the Bible, affirming that. In fact, let me go a little bit further. I almost think that the natural outworking of a concordist interpretation of Scripture is the old earth view. I might want to qualify that a little bit if I was in a more deep discussion with people. But when I hear Hugh Ross talk about his concordism, I'm like, he's right. I can, if you're a concordist, I kind of can see how you get that view from it. And I'm like, I don't think that's the correct view. So we want to make sure that we're not confusing science and Scripture, and that we are letting them inform each other, but we have to be clear about which one wins when there is a conflict. So in general, that is where I stand on that. Now, with respect to the text that that he brought up, yeah, Tyler and I have gone back and forth on this one as well. I still don't see how it affects. I mean, I know young Earth creationists, old Earth creationists, and don't care creationists who all affirm some version of the light being created, um, of even the sun having been created on day one, or at the beginning, absolute beginning of creation. So I don't even necessarily think that there's a hard contradiction in the young Earth view. If you take that approach, I do take the approach that the sun was created on day 4. I think that those who want to make the point about the Bible teaching a polemic point, on that, and that the sun is not named and that it is created, after the creation of some of the other elements and by God, I think that it makes more sense from a polemic view. And polemic just basically means that it takes shots at the gods of other nations and the worldview beliefs of other nations. I actually believe that point is made stronger if the sun was literally not created until day 4. There's a book by a Hebrew scholar, a well-respected Hebrew scholar, David M. Fouts. And I mean, again, this guy is friends with, you pick your favorite Hebrew scholar, he's friends with him, I promise. And he wrote a book in 2007, I think, called Right from the Start. And it's calling evangelical leaders back to the truth of God's word in Genesis 1 and 2, I think is something like that. And he gives a scholarly approach, in the popular, it's a popular format, but he delves deep into the Hebrew language, and actually deals with these texts and exegetes them, and argues for their being, a literal account of creation. And this is a guy who's well up on ancient Near Eastern studies, Semitic studies. I mean, he knows all of this stuff, and yet he still comes down on this view. And there's a passage here. I've got the book pulled up, where he argues, and I'm kind of going back and forth on whether or not I should actually read this little excerpt or not. I think I'm going to not read it, but I will tell you the book is worth picking up. Again, it's Right from the Start by David M. Fouts, and you can get it. I've got it in Logos and on Kindle, I believe. So you can definitely get it in both places. And he goes into great detail. Well, I mean, in detail, as much detail as you can in a paragraph or two, about how that the Hebrew verbiage, the actual way the text is structured, very strongly argues that the point of that the text is making is that the sun and the moon were created as a direct response to the command that God was making. It's not as though they were just made to appear or something like that. There's other language that could have been used if that was the intent. The idea is that each of these, this is a direct quote, each of these, so the two great lights, the greater light, the lesser light, and the stars, each of these direct objects has its own separate direct object marker, et. It's in the Hebrew language, et. This indicates that they were all created in response to God's command, and most likely at the same time, as they are followed in verse 19 with the temporal summary, and there was evening and there was morning the fourth day, end quote. So anyway, point there is that there are Hebrew scholars who think that the point that Michael is making is not right, and they'll argue this based on the Hebrew language. So again, whether or not it's a material account of creation really isn't even pertinent to the issue of whether age is in view. But even if you think it is for some reason, there is evidence in the text itself to suggest that, very strongly actually, that material creation of these things was in view, and it was their direct, a direct response to God's command.
So just to kind of think about our options, and that was really good. I like that. Just think about our options. Okay, so it's literally that on that day, those verses are literally meaning that the sun and the moon were created.
Mhm.
And people say, well, what was the light he created before? I'm perfectly comfortable with, I don't know.
Yeah, for
I'm
sure.
fine with that answer. It's one of those things where it's like, I have no idea. And
For
I don't
sure.
need to, I don't need to actually have the scientific explanation of, like, he, in the video, he goes into about, the this and that. It's like, I don't need all that. I don't know what it was. God knows what it was.
That's right.
But okay, so on that view, okay, young Earth creation, viable option. You got the what Jones presented about, light was created before, and then verse 14 is functionality. Okay, how does
Cool.
that do anything at all to undermine the age question?
Mazel tov, man. Cool.
It doesn't affect whatsoever. Or you can go to where I've heard people argue that this contradiction, this kind of thing, it's talking all figurative, just shows that Genesis 1 isn't to be taken literal, which, okay, now we're back to Genesis 2 being the beginning
Sure.
of the timeline. Young
Sure.
Earth creation still on the table. We've done nothing to undermine it or disprove the Bible teaching it. Okay.
Mic drop.
Next.
Number 3, Genesis 1:28. As noted before, young Earth believers say before the fall, the Earth was blissful and perfect, with no death or suffering. But Genesis 1:28 suggests the opposite was true. Humanity is told to subdue the Earth and have dominion over all animals. In Hebrew, these words are extremely harsh. The first word is used of war conquest and enslavement. The second word refers to ruling harshly over someone, or oppression. So God is telling humans to make a warlike conquest on the earth because it needs subdued, implying the earth wasn't perfect, and humanity was elected to transform the earth into a better place. But to do that meant tackling the harsh environments forcefully. The scholar Joshua John Van Eat notes the use of the second word for ruling over the animals seems to suggest humans had the right to use animals for any purpose, like food and clothing, implying they already had the right to kill and eat animals. But this means the command from God implies the earth was not a perfect, blissful creation. Instead, this verse implies the earth was chaotic and needed order brought to it. Also, humans seem to be given the right to kill animals, implying death was already in existence.
Okay, so apparently the earth wasn't all paradise. Eden was all cool and stuff, but outside of Eden was all wilderness and chaos.
I mean,
So
that
therefore,
little.
young earth creation is done.
I mean that little verse right there. If you caught Michael's drift, implied an awful lot of things. I mean, there. I almost don't know where to start. Okay. So to your first point there, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with guys like Heiser who say, it could be that the entire earth was an Eden. Okay. So let's say I grant that point. It doesn't necessarily mean that the entire earth was full of evolutionarily evolving humans either. Okay. I think I would be willing to grant that the entire earth could have been filled and probably was filled. Yeah, probably was filled during creation with certainly animals. But I don't think we can say, especially from the text, that they were harsh or that they were that they were playing by different rules. This is where, again, we're getting into the weeds a little bit here, but this is where I'm a little undecided on the animal death thing. Now, if someone were to press me, I would say that I hold the view that there was no animal death before the fall either. But I'm comfortable admitting that there's a little bit of argument from silence going on there on my part from Genesis. I mean, Genesis 1:28 seems to suggest that the animals that were created were vegetarians. So I think, that probably lends itself to the view that there was no animal death before the fall. But there are good young earth creationist brothers that I have who do affirm animal death before the fall, just not human death. So I don't have all of that worked out in my mind. Would you be one of those? Yeah.
I definitely lean that way. I mean, I'm
Sure.
definitely, it's the
Sure.
arguments that there were no animal death just seem weak to me. I'm unconvinced.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's not like I don't think it impugns God's character at all that animals would die because I'm sorry, they're animals. Human death I could see could impugn his character, but not the animal death. And so I'm okay. I actually I agree with everything. I agree with what he said. That I kind of view it like not that the earth was just some just massive chaotic crazy. It was untamed wilderness. It was uncultivated untamed wilderness.
Sure.
In Eden you had the garden where everything was in perfect order,
the abode of God,
paradise. And then God said, hey, go make the rest of the world look like this. Go cultivate it. Go tame that wilderness.
Sure.
And I believe that's the view I hold.
No.
And it doesn't do anything to change the age of the earth.
No, that's true. Now, I think at this point it almost has to be a given that with respect to the point of the video that somehow this has something to do with the age of the earth. I think we left that a long time ago. It just we're almost beyond that now. We're talking about something different at this point, because it obviously doesn't prove anything about the age for the earth. I do think I'm troubled in my mind by things like, well, what do you do with the fossil record? What do you do with thorns and thistles? What do you do with the introduction of cancer and harmful diseases and things like that? These are things that it seems to suggest, the Bible seems to suggest that these things resulted from the curse on the ground. It doesn't seem to me that the ground was only cursed in Eden, because Adam had to toil and do the hard work outside of Eden. So obviously it was the ground outside of Eden that was cursed.
Well, and it was in Eden, like if Eden was home base, food was plentiful. He wasn't going to have to toil to survive.
Right.
The work and the toil would be taming the wilderness.
Yeah.
Which would have been a fun glory. And I don't think that like whenever I say outside of Eden it was untamed wilderness, maybe there weren't thorns and thistles.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And that came later. Maybe
sure. Maybe it's not A or C. Maybe it's B, right? Maybe it's it could, right? And that's more so just speculation.
I absolutely do believe that there were very real physical effects of the fall, with like diseases and cancer, and there were real things that happened with to the earth and the functionality of the earth, the curse upon it, and then of course a global flood then completely just messes up everything. If that really
and of course, so much of that is actually dependent upon the curse itself. The ground was cursed and things like that, but with cancer and different things like that coming into the picture, you can really only have that stuff if you get degradation genetically. Now we're getting into science, but if you get genetic degradation, and that stuff is going to happen almost naturally as a result of the immortality of the source of life being cut off, the tree of life.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely part of the curse is leaving Eden, but I think the actual ground was probably cursed too. If you think at the I mean, that's just what the text says. So I would think that.
And one of the things in these kind of, I find that a lot of times, and I'm just as guilty as anyone, that there's all kinds of extra things that we add into being implied that the text doesn't actually say.
Yeah.
So
you're right.
So like about the thorns and thistles. Oh, so it was wild outside Eden, so there were thorns and thistles. I don't know. Maybe there were, maybe there weren't. It doesn't actually tell us. It just says that now, as he tries to produce food, he's going to
Yeah.
have to contend with thorns and thistles. Whereas
Yeah.
in Eden, he wouldn't have to.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. Good point.
But again, you come around. Top 10 ways the Bible doesn't teach young Earth.
How? Yeah.
How? What is
Yeah.
this? This doesn't have anything to do with
Yeah.
the dating.
Well, and I'll make a more, I guess, a more direct point here. So he's pointing out um, two Hebrew words that he says specifically, that they both had to do with essentially a harsh, sort of subduing it's like a forceful type thing. He actually says that what God's doing is telling humans to mount. I wrote this down, to mount a warlike conquest on the earth. To me, go ahead.
I was going to say, have you read any historical accounts of the settlers in North America? Carving out civilization in the colonies? Yeah, that was waging a war on the, the wilderness environment in order to carve out a place for civilization.
Yeah.
So actually,
Yeah.
that language doesn't. Yeah, okay, small church, a little country preacher here. You got to wage war on the land.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you want uncultivated land to grow something, hey, waging war is a very good descriptor of
Sure.
what you're having to do to it.
Sure. I think that's fair. But I don't think it implies that means that I'm not sure entirely. Well, I think I know what his point is. I mean, I think his point is that animals and other and other humans that were not, Adam and Eve essentially were going to have to be, brought under subjection. And I mean, the point is this, like these context determines meaning of a word. That's just how it works. Context determines meaning. Both of these words are used in contexts in the Bible where they do not imply a sort of harsh rule. As a matter of fact, in 1 Kings 4:24 and 25, it specifically points to Solomon's rule, his radah, as being a peaceful rule. So it doesn't necessarily imply that. And again, David Fouts made the point in his book that actually what you see, especially if you take it, with the language of Adam and Eve being made in the image of God and as God's essentially vice regents, to rule as God's image on the earth, that really what you see here is it suggests that Adam and Eve had the kind of rulership that kings had. And kings, sure, at times ruled with force, but they could also rule peacefully. The point is that they brought the land into subjection, that they that they began to care for the land, that they began to take responsibility for the land, to make it to demand that these words teach that they were going to have to fight predatory animals before the fall, I think is too much of a stretch. I think it could mean that, but it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that. These words could be very comfortably used in a more peaceful context. I mean, did the author? I'm more likely to think. I mean, good heavens! I mean, it talks about having this kind of rule over the fish of the sea or whatever. I mean, I don't think what we're talking about is like getting in these wrestling matches with bears and whales. That's almost what I see in my mind when I see this point being made. I think what you're saying is a lot more like I'm happy with the warlike language if what's being implied here is something like, like actually having to war with the land to take the land into subjection and to subdue it. But think about it, like, is that really all it means? So one of my favorite books is Faith, Form, and Time by Dr. Kurt Wise. It's an old book, but it's still very pertinent today. It was written in 2001. And Dr. Wise is a scientist, a creationist. And
Did you just refer to a book written in 2001 as old?
well, in scientific terms, yes. Yeah, I see your point, but in scientific terms, 2001 is basically ancient. So yeah, that's why I did that. But yes. Yeah, so the point is though, like he uses this passage as a justification for doing science, for caring for the land, for learning more about the land, for studying about the land. And I see no reason to think that that's not implied just as much as anything else. You know, I mean, the only consistent environmentalism is Christian environmentalism. And where do we get that from but something like the Dominion Mandate? So I mean, I guess if you want to use that warlike language, fine, but let's define what we mean by that. And before we move on, even if it does mean that he had to fight predatory bears, even if it does mean that lions and tigers and bears and cheetahs, oh my, were out to get him, I still have no idea why that had to happen over the.
Uh-oh.
Am I still here?
Yeah, you froze up after I have no idea why that had to. And then you froze.
Oh, sorry. I think what I was saying is I have no idea why that had to happen if he's right over millions of years rather than just thousands of years ago.
Yeah, there's nothing there that would necessarily imply old age. It just means that was their job, a different understanding of what they were called to than some people hold.
Yeah,
Okay.
and actually, let me say that this, because now I'm remembering what the point that I was trying to make way back at Jeremiah 4, and that is the best case scenario is that this sort of interpretation would be consistent with an old age. That's the best case scenario, but it certainly doesn't argue for an old age. If
Right.
anything, it argues for a young age. At best, it's consistent with an old age.
Yeah. Okay, next.
Number 2, Bara. Number 2 is not so much a passage, but the use of a Hebrew word. Many young earth creationists believe this word refers to God creating out of nothing, and it is used frequently throughout Genesis 1. But looking at how the word is used outside of Genesis 1 implies Bara doesn't necessarily mean creation out of nothing. It might not even refer to material creation at all. John Walton has done a full semantic analysis on the word, and he points out the word never necessarily means creation out of nothing, and there are several times it cannot mean that. In Psalm 51, the author uses Bara to ask God to make a new clean heart within him. This obviously doesn't refer to the creation of a new material heart out of nothing. In Isaiah 65, it refers to electing Jerusalem to be a place of joy. In Isaiah 43, it refers to creating the nation of Israel, which came about over time and through natural processes. In Ezekiel 21, it refers to making a sign. It is even used to refer to David not eating food. There are times it could refer to material creation out of nothing, but it never necessarily does, and there are clear examples where Bara cannot refer to material creation. So there is no reason to assume that that is the meaning in Genesis 1, especially given the previous problems that we have gone over. Kenneth Matthews notes Bara more likely refers to bringing about activity rather than material manufacturing, implying Genesis 1 is not about material creation.
You know, I think this is another one of those where you could basically just land yourself in a match of scholar quotation ping pong.
Yes.
You know, because notice he said, it doesn't necessarily mean creation from nothing. Well, yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not saying creation from nothing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. You're exactly right. And with respect to this particular point, yeah, you're right. You could just go back and forth. I mean, Paul Copan and William Lane Craig have an entire book about this called Creation Ex Nihilo, where they examine the the evidence for creation ex nihilo, be it, in the Bible and in Genesis 1, might be a good resource to look at as well. And I know different Hebrew scholars that are divided on this, that there really are. But the point of the word bara, though, is I think that I originally wrote down when I was taking notes on this that this was a straw man of the young earth creationist view. And while in some respects that may be true, I also think that a lot of young earth creationists just get this wrong. There is a significance to the word bara, but it's not in that it only necessarily means material creation. In fact, I think I should say at least many young earth creationists, especially, educated ones who write books and are, public about this stuff. I don't think any of them would argue that bara is used exclusively of material creation. What we do argue, truthfully, is that in the Bible, the word bara is only ever the subject of the word bara is always Yahweh. It's always God. It's the God of the Bible. That's the real significance behind it. So I guess I don't know if I should amen Michael here. Probably, I don't know, because I agree it is used in material and non-material creation. At least it appears to be. But the point is that it's only ever used of God. It's only ever used of Yahweh. Yahweh is the only one who can bara. Others can asa or yatsar. These are all synonymous words, Hebrew words, but only God can bara. So,
Okay. And just another thing that I think it would, you know what, this kind of actually leads into the next one, so I'll save that comment for there.
fair enough.
So, I mean, this is one of those things where it's like, okay, you
Cool.
didn't actually, again, good job. I don't know what this has to do with the actual age, because the age, and I'll stress this a little more in the closing. Age has to do with the timeline.
Right.
It actually has to do with what events happened and when. Okay, so bara, creation from nothing, not creation, okay. Next.
Yep. Next.
And now finally, number 1, Genesis 1, verse 1. This may come as a shock to you, but the very first verse of the Bible can create difficulties for young earth models. The reason is, over the past few decades, scholars have noted the first verse lacks a definite article in Hebrew, so the way we translate it may not be accurate. Instead, scholars like John Salhammer and Robert Homestead have argued it would make more sense to translate it as when God began to create the heavens and the earth. What this would mean is verse 1 is no longer a complete sentence, but what we would call a dependent clause in an incomplete sentence. So this would mean verse 1 is dependent on the following clause, which is in verse 2. So Genesis is really saying, when God began to bara the heavens and the earth was formless and void. In other words, when God started baraing the heavens and the earth, it was already there as formless and void. So many scholars note this implies Genesis 1 is not about bringing the universe and the earth into existence for the first time, but is about God transforming the earth from a chaotic state into an ordered state. If the Hebraic form of verse 1 and 2 implies the earth was already there existing before the creation week, then the text supports an extended period of time prior to this and is not actually stating the absolute beginning point of our universe.
Okay, we got Genesis 1:1 all completely wrong. We're toast. You know what's interesting? And I had a few points that I'd written down, but one thing that had just occurred to me as I was listening to that this time, if God was, if Genesis 1:1 is where God, reordered, and planet had existed for a long time before that, science doesn't work. It doesn't matter what the actual age that the universe and Earth had been around, because everything would date back to Genesis 1:1, because that's where God started shaping. So you would not have any scientifically testable and observable or anything kind of processes going before that, because at Genesis 1:1, it all changed.
Right.
So right there, all of the old Earth science models, just threw them in the trash.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And this is another one that kind of has to do with that, scholar this and scholar that says one thing and says the other. Again, I'll point you to David Fouts' book. He just grammatically he goes through this objection and just shows why it would be arbitrary and quite spurious, actually, to say that this that we should interpret this verse without the definite article. In other words, it would make much more sense grammatically to include the definite article. You have other cases in the Bible that you can point to where if you were to exclude the definite article with the grammatical structure being exactly the same, then it would be absurd. So, there's technical reasons that go beyond my, time to explain them to you right now, and even some of my own personal understanding, but I can read and comprehend what he says, and I think the argument goes through. So again, this is one of those things where, okay, well, he may be true, he may be right about that. I actually know young earth creationists who take varying positions on this, and they're all young earth creationists, and the reason is because this verse does not affect the age of creation, the date of creation and the age of the earth thereafter. So I know scholars who will take Hebrew scholars and also scientists and others who will take verse 1, Genesis 1:1, as a summary statement, what they call an introductory encapsulation. Such that it is not a statement of material creation, but yet a summary statement. It is, of course, a merism, because there's no word for universe in Hebrew. So a merism takes kind of the two extremes of a whole, the heavens and the earth, in order to takes the two ends of the extremes, the two parts, to explain the whole. So and you can still hold that it's a merism, and at the same time hold that it's a literal statement of creation, or you can hold that it's not a literal statement of creation, at which point the literal state of creation begins with verse 2, with it explaining how the actual state of the earth when the earth was created. Okay, fine. You still have to deal with Exodus 20:11, which says that the heavens and the earth and everything in them was created in 6 days. That verse is still in the Bible, awkward as it may be. So we still have to deal with that. Even if you think that Genesis 1:1 is just a summary statement, I think Exodus 20 and verse 11 still constricts you. I actually found it quite interesting that Michael didn't deal. There are verses and passages. Now I'm making a more general point now, but there are verses in the passages in the Bible that you could more directly point to if you're going to try to show an old age for the earth. And maybe that's what we should do sometime, Mark, is try to steel man this and come up and say, well, here's what you'd have to do to actually show, because history is pretty much agreed from Abraham to today. On the timelines. I mean, there are definitely like hundreds of years worth of fluctuation. You have different people who take Egyptian timelines differently. You have even the monarchies and some of the rulerships of Israel, people wonder about. But this is why Genesis, well, this is one reason why Genesis gets attacked so much, is because it's the only place in the Bible where you could find those millions of years if you were looking to find them in the biblical text. So be interesting to actually point out passages like Exodus 20:11 and others that could be more directly impactful on the age of the earth. But I think we've missed 10 out of 10 on this one.
Yeah, and this gets back to, okay, so Genesis 1:1 isn't specifically saying this is when God created the whole thing. This is when he starts to form it. Okay, so when, according to the Bible, did that actual creation from nothing happen? Because we know it did. There's plenty of other verses that tell us that.
Sure.
That there's absolutely nothing. It's like, okay, where do you insert the millions and billions according to the text? It's not there.
That's the question.
And as you said, okay, well, to answer that question, let's go to Exodus. What does this say? Oh, it seems to pretty clearly say. So, all right.
Yeah. And I have to say, just for the sake of it, that because that is one of the verses. If you could show that Exodus 20 and verse 11 did not mean 6 ordinary days, if you could show that, that would definitely deal a blow to the excuse me, to the creationist view. What's really interesting is all these scholars, we've mentioned a few of them tonight, Walton, Heiser, and there are probably a few others. Pretty much any of the Hebrew scholars who take the position that the Bible is not teaching the age of the earth all actually believe that the text is assuming a 7 regular day pattern. In other words, you've got a very small list. I frankly, I can only name one off the top of my head of Hebrew scholars who would affirm the Hugh Ross view that you could take these days to literally mean eons of time somehow. I'm not even sure how that works, but there's a few who would affirm that. You are either going to have Hebrew scholars for the vast majority. You've either got Hebrew scholars who think the text says a literal 6-day creation and means that, and that's actually what happened in reality, or you're going to have them who think the text says a literal 6-day creation, but it doesn't mean that for whatever reason. And so you'd have a pretty hard time showing that verses like Exodus 20 and verse 11 don't actually point to that material reality. So for what that's worth. But the best, I was going to say that the best argument that I've heard against that was from Tyler Vela, who said, well, if we assume Mosaic authorship and Moses wrote Exodus 20 and verse 11 and wrote Genesis 1, then whatever he meant by day in Exodus 2011, he meant the same thing by day in Genesis 1. Of course, Tyler Vela, though, also does believe that this means that or that what's at view are 7 literal days or 6 literal days of creation and then a 7th day of rest. He just doesn't believe that literally that's what the text was teaching. He believes that that was what the authors assumed. But yeah.
Right. That he was using, the concept of days in writing this polemic against the Egyptian gods. So,
yeah.
Okay. I think there's like one last little few moments of wrap up, unless there's something I forgot to edit off. So let's go ahead and take a look at that, and then we'll do some closing.
Now, I know some of these points might come as a shock to you, but we are not arguing this creates problems for the biblical worldview, just for young earth models that claim to be based on biblical texts. Given all of these points, the biblical scriptures don't seem to support many of the claims of young earth creationists. As we have argued, it is clear a plain reading of Genesis does not necessarily support a 6,000-year-old earth, and there are many issues that arise when proponents of this idea say we should just take the biblical text literally.
Okay, and this is where I keep coming back to, because he says that that many of young earth views on the Bible, it's like, okay, even if we take every single one of the things that if all 10 he was absolutely right and young earth creationists are wrong, it still has not one bit affected what's the age.
Right.
Because and this is where I really, this is where I landed, because for years, like I said, I grew up being taught, the Kent Hovind brand of young earth creation teaching, and all of that. And I find it funny that a lot of the arguments that I hear from people against young earth creationism are about 40 years out of date, or more. Of course, you know that more
Usually
than I do,
more.
but I got tired of all of the back and forth about when was light created and what does bara mean and what is yom and whenever it has a, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, hold on a second. You're nitpicking about some minor interpretive or linguistic details. When did the events happen? That is the question. And you either take the Bible from Adam forward as being historical. Now, it can include all kinds of metaphor and figurative thing, and you can have gaps in genealogies, and you can have the ages of the genealogies being figurative and symbolic numerology stuff. You can have all of that. Did these events actually happen in human history? That's the question. And unless you just say, no, they're all myth, well, then you're having to say, okay, well, these events happened, and at most, we're talking 10,000 years. So
Yeah.
where did we undo young earth creation in any of
Yeah.
this?
I mean, that's a great point. And I really thought that this video, I almost want to call it an expose the way it was set up, but I really thought that this video like missed the mark on a few very key points. I mean, if you'll notice that these were the biblical arguments that were supposed to create problems for young earth creationism. But you'll notice that, like, some of the classic ones, you mentioned some of those classic arguments that we see here, he didn't say anything about the word yom. You notice that? And that used to be such a hot button topic. Well, I assure you, Michael is well read in the literature of Hebrew scholars. You're just not going to find some wide swath of Hebrew scholars who believes that you can squeeze millions of years out of the word yom. You notice that you didn't hear him mention anything about the relationship between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Because for a while, people wanted to insert millions of years of time into that gap, called the so-called gap theory. And the problem is that, again, grammatically, Hebrew will not allow what you need to have in order for that gap theory to hold true. So all of these places where before people wanted to insert millions of years into the Bible, you can't get them, it turns out, from Hebrew grammar. Okay. So what you have to do in order to sidestep the problem is, and again, I know, I realize that some people might be taking my language as, that he's trying to mythically devise some sort of cryptic. I hope you remember from the very beginning of this, broadcast that there's no ill will towards Michael, for any of this.
No.
It's just the reality is, this is what he's trying to do, is show the young earth creation has problems from the text, and he's failed to do that.
And honestly, whenever I saw that he was posting this video, I thought, oh man. I mean, because I'm a young earth creationist, and I'm like, dude, I mean, if anyone's about to torpedo this, Michael's going to, because like we said before, he's very thorough, very well researched. He is on, even on things that I disagree with him on, I would not debate him, because he's smarter than I am, because I mean, he brings his, I mean, whenever he does a topic, he brings it. And then I watched this and I thought that this doesn't even get into the age of the earth.
Yeah.
Like you didn't even address the topic.
Yeah. Not
what he addressed,
not one bit.
Yeah, and this comes back to, like we said at the beginning, he wasn't addressing the age of the earth. He was addressing a specific hyper literalist biblical interpretation that kind of often, like squeaky wheel gets the grease, gets the attention, but like next to no one actually holds that view. And it's something, like I said, a lot of times what's being pushed back on is 40, 50, years old or older. Because like I remember as a kid kind of hearing more of the more hyper literalist kind of argument. But I'm 42. I'll be 43 in March. I haven't heard that kind of hyper literalist talk for most of my adult life. And that's from the mouths of young Earth creationist scholars and proponents. Okay, I don't even know how hard, how much some of this would even apply to like a Answers in Genesis type. So some of this even I think Answers would go, okay, Earth is still young.
Well, they would point you to 400 articles that they've written already addressing all of this stuff. And the same thing would be true of CMI. Now, I mean, you're going to have, again, there are ancillary things. Like, okay, another scholar who's a lot like Michael Jones. Actually, Michael gets a lot of his, I don't want to say gets his material from him, but he's a scholar that he relies on, is Ben Stanhope. You ever heard of Ben? No. His YouTube channel is Pixels and Papyrus. And he's got some videos that are a lot like Michael's. Some of his videos are directly addressing the Creation Museum. I actually just downloaded a book from Kindle that he released not too long ago that says 10 things the Creation Museum gets wrong or something like that. And again, it's often these points with like, okay, Behemoth and Job and Leviathan. Okay, what if they are not real animals and they are just chaos monsters, chaos symbols from the ancient Near East? Okay, cool. Maybe the Creation Museum got that wrong. If assuming that's true, maybe the Creation Museum got that wrong. What does that have to do with the age of the Earth? Now, I get the point, right? The point is, Answers in Genesis wants to find a dinosaur in the Bible with Behemoth, and they may or may not be able to point to the dinosaur in the Bible. If not, okay, fine. You still have to deal with the fact that God created all the animals supposedly in a 6-day period of time, around 6 to 10,000 years ago, if you do math and look at the biblical record and take these events as historical. So I'm not trying to find a dinosaur in the Bible. If it's there, great. That really helps. But I'm not necessarily trying to find it. So you have all these, these ancillary things. Stanhope was probably the first one I heard make the point about the ages of the genealogies and about Sumerian king lists and all these other things where you have parallels, and there's probably some sort of cipher going on there. Heiser, when he talks about it, he says, yeah, there's probably some sort of numerical cipher going on there, but I don't know that we'll ever know what it is. Okay, well, right now, we haven't found one, and you don't know what it is. So at least right now, grant me that we're not an idiot for looking at the Bible and just taking it. Okay, fine. Some of the numbers are rounded, probably. Like it's probably like if it said somebody lived 500 years, they might have been 498, like, or something like that. Like, we're not begging for strict literalism here.
I'm pretty sure if I lived that long, I'd probably lose count.
Yeah, right.
Just round it.
But the point is, 500. It doesn't necessarily mean that 500 means 30,000, and you don't really have any evidence that the biblical writer had that kind of thing in mind. And unless you can specifically address those things, then any of the little ancillary things, if you're mad about things that Answers in Genesis teaches about Behemoth and about whatever, okay, fine. But until you address the core question, like, just stop. Just like, and the arguments, here I am ranting, but like, it's just like you said, so many of them get repeated. There's another scholar I just recently, the last episode of my podcast was a little bit of a rant I did. I think I titled it Creation Frustration. And it was talking about another scholar who just recently has taken up the cross of young earth, of arguing against young earth creationism for some reason. And I honestly, like, I asked him on Facebook, I was like, why are you taking up this cross and yet repeating things that, like, I mean, he was talking about stuff like light created in transit. I mean, views that creationists have not held for 20 years. I was just like, man, like, if you're going to take up this cross, read something that a young earth creationist scientist has written in the last 20 years. Just please, I'm begging you. Or that a Hebrew scholar has written in the last 20 years that who agrees with I can give you a list. I keep a spreadsheet, okay? I can give you a list of Hebrew, of active and retired Hebrew scholars who can argue from the text for a young earth creationist position. Don't selectively read. Don't read only the scholars that you agree with already. Like, find some you disagree with. And I do that. I mean, I read Walton and Heiser and all these other guys. Like, read some of the guys who affirm young earth creationism. Read Barrick. Read what's the guy, Robert, I always forget his last name, but his first name is Robert. He's written some really good stuff against the framework interpretation. He was at Dallas Theological Seminary. Read Stephen Boyd. Read Jeremy Lyons. Read these guys who take the young age position and are qualified Hebrew scholars and Semitic scholars. Read David Fouts, the guy I mentioned before. Like, don't stay so narrow. And I think, like, I can't for the life of me understand this selective scholarship. Like, why are they never considered in these things? Like, it bothers me.
Well, and one thing that hit me, and I don't even remember where I stumbled across it. And then once I went down that rabbit hole, whenever people start to say, "Oh, well, the Bible doesn't teach young Earth," the young Earth, I love this one, that young Earth creation, that the young Earth creation movement was birthed out of Seventh-day Adventism, and it's really only came back to what was it, the like 70s is when and it's like you realize that it's like, even if the current iteration of the movement birthed out of that, for thousands, literally thousands of years, people have dated creation to a young. Right now, as we sit here in January 2021, on the Hebrew calendar, we are in the year 5781.
Right.
According to the Byzantine calendar, what was the official church calendar of the Eastern Church, we are currently sitting in the year 7529. So tell me again that young Earth was just some recent creation based on no.
Well, and like I was actually going to post this on Facebook, and then I was traveling at the time, so I when I was watching this, so I didn't. I watched an interview the other day, came up on YouTube, between it was like a 20-minute interview. William Lane Craig being interviewed by the leader of one of these like Baptist fellowships somewhere. I was going to text, or I was going to post something to the effect of, "Oops, that awkward moment when your favorite, old Earth evolution affirming apologist agrees with young Earth creationism," and he made 2 points. That the whole interview was basically to get to 2 points. The first point was that by far for the vast majority of history, the church has affirmed a literal interpretation that would imply, okay, a young Earth interpretation of the Bible. That he said that is just without question. There was, and actually he went further than that. He specifically said until the advent of modern geology, modern biology, modern astronomy, he specifically said until the advent of those scientific disciplines, that was the majority position of the church. So, okay, young Earth creation has been preaching that for years. I don't care what quote you want to pull out from Origin or whatever, like that. It's just indisputable.
And even when you had people who would interpret Genesis more figuratively, they weren't imagining millions of years. I mean,
right.
Like the reformers, I think, even kind of argued about, like, why would it be 7 days? God can do it instant. He doesn't need 7 days.
Augustine held that view. Augustine held the view that it was done instantly, and that there had been 6,000 years of time no more than 6,000 years of time that had passed, but that the creation event itself was instantaneous. So like you're like you're grasping for straws with that. And the other point that that Dr. Craig made was affirming the humanity of Neanderthals. He said, as I looked at the research, and there's more research that's coming out every single day, he said, I just can't deny that they had every bit of the cognitive ability as modern humans do. And so he said, I think in order to be biblically faithful and scientifically accurate, he said, we're going to have to include Neanderthal and the one that came right before. Was it Heidelberg? I can't remember. But Neanderthal and the one that comes right before Neanderthal man, we're going to have to be included in our definition of modern humans. And because of that, he revises the date of Adam and Eve to 750,000 years ago. And his when he makes the argument, he goes through this in his defenders class. Don't take my word for it. You can look it up for yourself. Honestly, the one move he makes that allows him to get back to that is that relationship of the genealogies. He does argue that Genesis is a mytho-history, but I think I would be fine for the sake of argument saying that Genesis could be written in a mytho-historical language or mytho-historical genre and still be a young Earth. But for that, he has to make the move that the genealogies are likely non-literal, and that's really the only thing that he can say to get that amount of time in there. But he affirmed what young Earth creationists have been saying and have been lambasted for decades. Oh, Neanderthals are not human. Even Hugh Ross and them, reasons to believe. Well, no, I mean, yeah, we absolutely have evidence that Neanderthals bred with modern humans, but that means that humans committed bestiality and that there were, all this stuff. And it's just with more and more research by unlikely voices, it's all, being confirmed for the young Earth view. Now the Hebrew scholars are saying, well, yeah, it kind of is talking about 7 days, and it kind of is talking about a global flood. It just doesn't mean that. And the scientists are saying, well, yeah, actually, you could take. I mean, Josh Swamidas, I don't know if you've seen any of his stuff, but the scientists are kind of saying, well, yeah, like you actually could take Genesis literally and have all this, and well, yeah, Neanderthals kind of were humans, and oh yeah, by the way, the church has agreed with young Earth creationism for its entire history until the advent of modern science. All of these things are now being taught by the scholars who have disagreed with the view for so long. And despite that, there is still this constant, almost, what's the word for it? A denigration of anybody who believes in a young Earth. Like, I just wonder when the cancel culture for young Earth creation is going to start, because it really has, it's almost like that you're still a caveman. If you believe in young Earth creationism, you're still a caveman. And yet the claims of young Earth creationists keep getting vindicated with each passing generation. I don't understand it. I just don't.
Yeah. And I don't know. Because I know a lot of people, and I think I've shared before that what really did it for me. I mean, because I was brought up, I was taught that, people who don't believe in a 6,000-year-old, literal Adam and Eve, they believe evolution, that's the lies of the devil, and they're just denying God. And I was taught all that. And then I went to college where I served in a campus ministry. And I served side by side with people who were born again, spirit-filled, God-loving, fierce warriors for the gospel on campus who believed in old Earth or
Right.
evolution.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, so you actually can love Jesus and believe this. And so
Right.
that, just,
Yeah.
And I just wonder, I don't know. I mean, so I think there's plenty of people out there who I'm not going to assign any kind of ill intent or scripture
Right.
twisting.
Sure.
But for some reason, whether it's just the cultural milieu or whatever, they have old age just imprinted in their thinking.
Yeah.
And what we've seen through these top 10 reasons the Bible doesn't teach young earth is that even if they're all right, it's not addressing the age at all. And so therefore they assume the old earth then? I mean,
Right. Yeah. At the very
So-
most, they can interpret the text in such a way as to be consistent with an old age. And this is a point that my friend Doug made. I wish I could give him full credit. I'm trying to think of his last name. I'll think of it the minute we get off this call, but his name's Doug. He and his wife do some really great stuff with apologetics work. He said, what's really interesting is the best case that the old earth creationists can make is that the Bible is consistent with their view, but they cannot make the case that their text teaches an old earth. For the young earther, though, the best case is that you actually can make the point that the text teaches it. And of course, it would therefore be consistent with it as well. So I think that's notable.
Yeah, and I just I always keep coming back to the idea of, the historical timeline gets us back to Adam. Now, if you want to argue about how much time that actually is back to Adam, it's not 4004 BC. Okay, so Usher was wrong. I don't care. Right? The Septuagint is true.
Right.
Okay, well then it was 5500 BC. But you get us back to Adam. So where do you get the time before Adam? Oh, well, because it ain't in the Bible. You don't get it in the Bible.
Sure.
You got, as we've seen in this video with IP, you get some places where you might be able to imply that it's possible that it would, but you don't, I mean, from what I see in the scripture, you get back to Adam. And then all the arguing goes on with Genesis 1, and either Genesis 1 is literal, in which case you have 6,000 years and 7 days, or Genesis is figurative, in which case you got 6,000 years. So,
right. Yep. Cool. Move along. So, nothing to see here. And again, that's all well and good, and it's all well and good for me and you to say that. But when does it change in the public discourse? When is it okay? And I have to say, I also just listened to a stream recently between Joshua Swamidas and William Lane Craig, and I can always have my qualms, but I will say that I've heard an attitude. I heard it was, so what they were doing, they were actually addressing some inflammatory comments that none other than Ken Ham made toward William Lane Craig.
No.
And yeah, that
Ken.
actually happened. And yeah, and they were addressing the comments, and I think actually for the most part I agreed with Bill Craig, and there were times when he agreed with Ken Ham and times when he disagreed. And there were, anyway, the point is I was actually encouraged by the language, especially Josh used, about, hey, let's open up a dialogue. Let's, they sounded willing to have some people dialogue with them on the issue. And so let's hope that that's the case, and let's hope that it can continue, and that maybe the tide is turning a little bit, because as of right now, it's still, well, it's like being I don't know if I should say his name, we might get canceled, but it's kind of like being a Trump supporter, to be a young, in the midst of cancel culture, right? To be a young earth creationist in the midst of modern academia. It's talked about, it's denigrated, it's canceled, it's not given a fair hearing. And yet when somebody says, show me the evidence of wrongdoing, show me where I'm wrong, we get top 10 lists like the one we just went through that never addresses the actual issue. And we get arguments that are 40 years out of date and don't even assume an awareness of anything new that a young earth creationist has written. And we get told things over and over again that we've heard repeated, like, oh, well, church fathers believed in an old earth, and the Seventh-day Adventists made up here. We get all these things that are historically false. They're just false. And so at what point is somebody going to be willing to hear the facts and give the young earth creationists a fair hearing? At the very least, stop insulting us for believing what we believe in the face. I mean, I saw a time, I didn't read it, but it literally like 3 days ago, my wife took a screenshot of this article on Apple News that was, we're going to have to rethink everything we know about the Big Bang. It's in shambles. And I didn't even read it. I'm just like, like surprise, surprise. Like, you know what I mean? I'm just, and of course those, you know, it's the news. So there's always going to be some sort of, you know, inflammatoriness there. But anyway.
Well, but I think one thing that I've seen happening is that on both sides, you have young Earth creationists who are willing to look at old Earth creationists and even theistic evolutionists and go, no, they're my brothers. They're just wrong.
Yeah.
And,
Sure.
you know,
Sure.
Rather than looking across the, table at them thinking, bunch of scripture twisting God deniers, right? It's,
Right.
they're my brother, they're just wrong. And then on the other side, rather than it being you bunch of science denying fundamentalists, it's, okay, well, I understand that's what you believe, but we're brothers. I just think you're wrong. And I think
Right.
that's one thing that's helping, is that we're kind of
It
getting
is.
that going on rather than, because but we got a long way to go because, like I've mentioned before, I got kicked out of a Young Earth group online on Facebook because I dared to say that you can be old Earth creationist and still be saved.
Right.
And all of a sudden, I was called
That's
every
insane.
name under the book. I was called a
man.
wolf in sheep's clothing, a false prophet. I was called, and then banned, kicked out and banned from the group. And I'm like, all I did.
I mean, young Earth creationists definitely bear some of the responsibility. I mean, a lot of the responsibility for how, it's kind of like, again, I'm just going to make the analogy because I think it's a darn good one. You get people who say, and Christians who say, maybe if Trump had just kept his mouth shut, he'd actually got elected for another 4 years. I think there's some truth to that. I think if he had been spared a personal Twitter account, he may be the president today. I mean, I honestly do.
If we had more teleprompter Trump and less Twitter Trump.
Yeah, like for sure. And so I think some of the, now again, we should call out people for false beliefs, sure. But what was demonstrated in that live stream between Josh Swamidass and William Lane Craig the other day was that a lot of times this inflammatory stuff goes beyond critiquing the ideas and it drifts into ad hominem and actually attacking the people as being pseudo-intellectuals, wolves in sheep's clothing, etc. And that's what's got to stop. And it makes me wonder, again, I don't want to put this in like a gory way or but I just wonder what's going to happen when that old guard isn't around anymore. And when some of these newer voices who are more gracious and more willing to, extend a hand across the aisle, extend that right hand of fellowship. You think liberty was fundamentalist? Bro, where I grew up, liberty was liberal. I'm telling you, like liberty is a liberal place. So I'm talking about that right hand of fellowship, brother. We got to extend that bad boy out across the aisle and get, and I think that the new guard is coming up, but the old guard still has a lot of influence. And, it may be that we don't get a fair hearing until those overpowering voices are no longer in the way, so to speak. I hate to put it that way, but to be that grim about it, but that just may be the reality. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good stuff. Hopefully, I'm not under any illusions that Michael would ever see this, but if he does, maybe he'll realize his mistake and come up with 10 actual challenges to young Earth creationism.
That'd be great. That'd be wonderful.
Here we go. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up here. Want to give a shout out to where people can learn more about you and find your stuff, because you got some good content out there.
Sure. If you do the YouTube thing, you can find it at Bible Nerd TV. If you like podcasts, you can find it at the Bible Nerd Podcast. And if you like reading, you can go to Steve Schramm enduringtogether.com. If you don't feel like spelling that, you can just go to enduringtogether.com, and it will actually just redirect right over to my website. So that might be a little easier to remember and to spell. I will say, bear with me a little bit. I'm not producing quite as much content as I would like to be right now because I'm still trying to figure out the balance. I went full time in my business, my web design business, a couple weeks ago, and I've taken on like 6 new clients since going full time, and so I'm trying to figure out how to manage my time with this and try to still do the ministry stuff. So it's a challenge. So pray for me, but please find me on those places. I plan to keep producing, lots of content going forward, but I'm just trying to get my sea legs and figure this stuff out. So.
Okay, and I will be sure to put links to all that in the description below. So, all right.
Thanks, man.
Well, thank
you
you
for your time.
And yeah, thank you for doing this. I watched that video and I'm like, I gotta respond to that, and I don't want to do it alone. So let's grab someone who's a little more knowledgeable on a lot of this than I am. So, all right, man, take it easy.
All right, bro. You too. Thank you.
And all of me, come within and take me deep, deeper